Hey guys, it's good to be with you today. As we look at Mark 6, verses 1 through 6, I want to begin by reading a quote from a commentary on the book of Mark that I thought was very helpful. The author writes, in the preceding stories, Jesus has displayed lordship over nature, demons, and death. But among his own people in Nazareth, he encounters misunderstanding and rejection. Heretofore, the crowds are amazed at Jesus' authority. But in Nazareth, it is Jesus who is amazed at their disbelief. Now think about that idea. Jesus was amazed at their disbelief. That line comes from in verse 6. We read, and Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. Maybe we should just take some time to think about that idea and ask ourselves, what would Jesus say about us? Would Jesus be amazed at how much we believe or how much we don't believe? How much faith we have or how much faith we don't have? Now, obviously, this is a really big deal. And what stands out to me about this passage is the connection that exists between the people's lack of faith and Jesus' inability to do miracles. Now, as Christians, we believe that Jesus was fully God and fully man. But sometimes when we read through the Gospels, we have a tendency to look at Jesus as being more God than man. At least I sometimes struggle with that. After all, look at all the miracles Jesus performed. He walks on water. He helps the blind to see, turns water into wine. He feeds the 5,000. I mean, doesn't that seem like it's more God than man? It seems like those things are impossible for us. And yet, if we look at this passage, the people who you would think would have known Jesus best. I mean, Nazareth wasn't all that big and he had grown up in that community. But the people who seem to have known him best didn't really know him at all because they didn't think Jesus was all that remarkable. I tend to think that he's more God than man sometimes when I'm not really, like thinking theologically about it. And yet these people, they didn't think he was God and they really didn't think he was all that impressive of a man either. Now, passages like this one in Mark 6 have led me to believe that while Jesus was here on earth, he voluntarily chose to limit his access to his divine attributes. Now, when I talk about this, I'm opening up a pretty significant can of worms because this is a very complex issue with a lot of theology behind it. There's lots and lots of books that have been written about this passage, some others in the Gospels. Philippians 2, 3 through 8 deals with this, but let me just say this. What I believe is that while Jesus was here on earth, he was not functioning in his omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. What I mean is he wasn't everywhere at once. He voluntarily chose to not be all knowing, and as we get a sense of in this passage, he wasn't all powerful. Now, if you have some questions about this, I'd be happy to try to answer them. But just know, it would be nice if you were kind and gentle and respectful because I could be wrong. I could be wrong on a lot of things, but what I believe is that when you look at this passage, it really means what it says. It doesn't say Jesus didn't do any miracles. It says that he couldn't do any miracles, right? So how does that make sense if Jesus was functioning in his omnipotence? Well, I think he voluntarily chosen to limit himself. And it points to the possibility that while Jesus was on earth, he was actually dependent upon the Holy Spirit to allow him to do supernatural things in the same way that ordinary Christians like you and me are dependent on the Holy Spirit. I believe that in Mark chapter 6, the Holy Spirit was grieved by the people's lack of faith in Jesus. And as a result, Jesus could not do any miracles. This is why I actually see a connection between this passage and Mark 3, verses 28 through 29, when the Pharisees are saying, or the religious leaders are saying that he is in league with Beelzebub. And Jesus is responding and he says, I tell you the truth. All the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven them, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. He is guilty of an eternal sin. Now, this so-called sin against the Holy Spirit, as N.T. Wright points out, it isn't that God actually hates certain sins more than others. It's that the problem of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is that once you label something of God as actually being evil, you become blind to the truth, and almost nothing can convince you differently. Let me give you an example. If you believe that there was a doctor, and let's say he was the only doctor who could perform a particular procedure in the whole world, right? And you needed him to perform that procedure to save your life. Well, if you believe that that doctor who is offered to perform a life-saving operation is actually a sadistic murderer, you will never agree to allow that doctor to perform surgery. And in so doing, you have cut yourself off from the only thing that could possibly save you, the only person who could possibly save you. I think it's something similar here in Mark 6. And I think this passage should cause us to carefully consider our lives and the people in our lives. Could God be at work in the life of someone you don't respect or like to be around? If we ask God to show up in our lives, are we being careful not to place conditions on how he appears to us? Because that's what the people of Jesus' hometown did. They missed out on what God wanted to show them. They missed out on really getting to know Jesus. In a sense, I think they blasphemed against the Holy Spirit. And so they missed out on what the Spirit wanted to show them. We need to learn from their mistakes. Let's open ourselves up to see what God is doing all around us.